Hello and welcome to Continual. Tonight, we are pleased to offer our Zombies Need Brains takeover. And with me to talk about the publishing house are its publisher and three of their editors, Joshua Palmatier, Patricia Bray, David B. Coe, and S.C. Butler. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Okay, first off, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves so that people know who you are. And I'm going to start with you, David.
Hi, my name is David B. Coe. I also write as D.B. Jackson. Under those two names, I've published a couple of dozen novels and as many short stories, ranging from epic fantasy to historical urban to contemporary urban to supernatural thriller. I've done some media tie-in work, and Derelict, which was just released by Zombies Need Brains, is my third co-editing venture.
Okay, great. Patricia?
I'm Patricia Bray. I've written epic fantasy. I did Regency romances. I've edited, I just had a pause there. I can't remember how many books I've edited with Josh in various incarnations or other partners. It may be 10, maybe but I have edited both in the, when we started working with Daw, and then of course with Zombies Needs Brains, and I've also written a few short stories.
Okay, great. Sam?
Hi, I'm S.C. Butler, Sam Butler. I am not quite as prolific as Patricia or David. I've written an epic fantasy trilogy, which the final volume came out in the dim, dark past from Tor Books, The Stoneways. And I've written since then several short stories, most often with ZNB, with Zombies Need Brains, though I've had a few other publications. And I've also recently self-published some stuff as well. For lack of alternatives. My editing career has begun with Zombies Needs Brains, not as quite as many as Patricia, though I was one of her co-editors once upon a time. But I think I'm up to 5 now. Josh could correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I've done 5, 4 with Josh and 1 with Patricia.
Great. And never fear, Joshua will correct you. It's part of his job. Anyway, Joshua, could you give us a little bit about yourself and tell us how Zombies Need Brains came to be?
Sure. I'm Joshua Palmatier. I am an epic fantasy writer with Daw Books. I have 9 books out at the moment, and they've contracted me for 3 more that should start coming out next year. So keep an eye out for those. Obviously, I'm the founder of Zombies Needs Brains, which was an insanity that happened, what, like 8 years ago or something like that, 8 or 9 years ago. But I'm having a blast with it. And how it came about, so as Patricia mentioned earlier, she and I did some editing with Daw Books. They used to do a whole bunch of anthologies each year, like 6 to 8 or something like that a year. And we pitched some ideas through Techno to Daw, and they bought them. That was After Hours, the first Urbar book, and then the Modern Phase Guide to Surviving Humanity. So those came out with Daw. And then there was a big blow up in the publishing industry. And one of the effects of that was that Daw kind of cut down their anthology line to just 1 or 2. And so we kind of initially said, well, let's just sit back and wait it out. You know, maybe they'll bring back the anthology line and bump it up again. But after a couple of years of waiting, I had gotten the editing itch at that point, and I got tired of waiting to scratch it. So, so I got this crazy idea to try creating my own small press and funding the anthologies through Kickstarters. And so I did a bunch of research, probably a year of researching to figure out how to do all of that. And finally, in I think it was 2013, I pulled the trigger and we ran the Kickstarter for Clockwork Universe. And I had initially planned on only doing one a year for a while, but it's quickly ramped itself up to 3 a year. So yeah, now we're doing 3 a year, and hopefully it will continue long into the future.
Is editing an itch? I mean, honestly, I did a little editing for about 7 years on Crescent Blues. I couldn't wait to escape. How do y'all, how could y'all keep doing this?
I'm the one that gets them all in trouble because I'm the one that comes to them and says, hey, I have this anthology. Do you want to co-edit it with me?
And you guys say yes. There is another word in the English language.
He keeps making offers that we can't refuse.
Seriously, it's so
are horse
lucrative.
heads and involved?
Yeah, it's so lucrative, Jean Marie, that we just can't say no. The money is just so good, year in and year out.
I don't believe that. Joshua actually knows how to add, which may be unique among authors. Okay.
Yeah, no, I took a year off. I'm like, no, Josh, things are crazy, like the last slush pile nearly killed me. It's a good year off. And then he asked me the following year, and by then I'd forgotten it. I'm like, sure. The trauma has faded,
And you all like to torture your fellow authors. I think that must be a part of it too.
Yeah. David makes a very good point about how lucrative it is. I think for the most stories we ever read in Slush, I think we were paid about approximately 60 cents a story. And some of those you can read in 5 minutes, but a lot of them take a lot longer than that.
Yeah, I know. And you guys do read through them all in hope of finding something good. So
you guys all get a check every 6 months.
Yes, we do.
I have to say, as far as lucrative, I mean, especially from the author standpoint, people are very pleasantly surprised at Josh, the regular royalties, the checks come. I mean, people have said that they've done anthologies with much bigger houses where everything's a black box mystery, or like the royalties show up 3 years late. But Zombies Need Springs, you will get, hand addressed by Josh. It's practically an autograph, a little envelope with your check at regular intervals.
It's very disheartening. Oh, go ahead, David.
No, I was just agreeing. It's true. We get paid regularly. And actually the rates we offer our writers are full SFWA rates. I mean, writers get paid very well to write for Zombies Need Brains.
Yes, we are. I will agree, but it's more fun to tease you guys. What were you about to say, Sam?
I was just going to say, It's very disheartening. My wife, Susan Jett, has sold several stories also to ZNB, but she's never edited it. I think she would run flying from the room if I even suggested it. But every 6 months, even though she's only written 3 stories, and I don't know, I've edited 5 and I've written 5 or something like this, her royalties are still double what mine are. And it's very discouraging.
Yeah, I think I edited one of the projects where we took one of her stories and not yours, but clearly she picked the right projects to submit to. I'm just saying.
Well, speaking of projects and editing and stuff, could you guys tell us a little bit about the anthologies that are now on the shelves, real and virtual? Derelict, When Worlds Collide, and the modern phase, not the modern phase, the Modern Deities Guide to Surviving Humanity, sort of a sequel to the Modern Fae. Could you tell us a little bit about those anthologies and how they came to be?
Well, the Derelict and When Worlds Collide were basically my ideas. I have this file where whenever an idea for an anthology pops up, I kind of dump it into that file. And then usually right around April every year, when the previous Kickstarter is kind of winding down and off to the printer and whatnot, I start thinking about what I want to do for the next Kickstarter. And so I basically lifted Derelict and When Worlds Collide out of this file. And Derelict just the idea of you know, the abandoned ship floating in space or the abandoned ship floating on the ocean, just like has always intrigued me. So it ended up in the file because of that. I was just like, you know, it'd be really cool if we could do an anthology about abandoned ships. And so that was in there just from, you know, passing thought, essentially. When Worlds Collide was a little bit more involved, because the initial idea was to have, I wanted an anthology where like universes were colliding. And in my head, I had this like short story idea about, you know, scientists accidentally starting a universe in their lab and the universe is expanding into our world. And, you know, I was like, ooh, what could we do with that? And, but that's like too specific. So it wouldn't work for an anthology idea. So I was thinking about how to expand it and make it something a little more workable for an anthology. And so instead of doing like universes colliding, I was like, okay, what if we say cultures are colliding? And then it was wide enough, because you could have, you know, two cultures in a fantasy world colliding. You could have a fantasy like through portals. You could have a fantasy colliding with a sci-fi culture, or you can just have, I just felt like there was a lot of variety there, a potential variety there. So, so that's how When Worlds Collide, the idea came about. And then the Modern Deity one was actually one that Patricia and I had in the box like ages ago, after we sold the Modern Fae anthology to DAW. So that one's been in the books for a long, long time. And we were just kind of waiting for the right moment to bring it out. You know, and initially I didn't want to do it right away because the other one was published by DAW and I was trying to establish Zombies on its own. So I kind of waited a little bit there. And then last year was the first one that kind of leapt to mind when I sat down to pick anthologies in April. And then the other two came as like pairings to the Modern Deity, because I try to do kind of like one urban fantasy-ish one and one that's kind of skewed more sci-fi and one that's skewed a little more fantasy, and that's my usual approach. And so, you know, Modern Deity is the urban fantasy, so I chose Derelict and When Worlds Collide. I thought they'd pair well with it.
Did Modern Deities come up because 2020 was kind of out of control?
It didn't specifically come up because of that, but that might have been the reason that it popped into my head.
Oh.
But yeah, it had just been on the list, and I just felt like it had been long enough that we could come out with Modern Deity and not feel like we were just trying to like rip off Modern Fae. Rip off's not the right word, but you know,
As a direct
Repeat.
sequel.
Yeah.
Yeah. Patricia, were you always signed up to do Modern Deities, or did you volunteer?
Well, Josh offered it to me, you know, and then he said, but if you want to do one of the other anthologies, I'm happy to swap, because while we may not look like it, in some ways we're like little Lego minifigs, and Josh just puts us in projects. And he says, I want, in some cases he's like, I know these editors, I work well with them, therefore like they can go. And I want to hear the reaction of everyone else to this, because I've been thinking about it, and Josh has the high level concept, which goes out in the Kickstarter, and we take our submissions from it. But then we have to, the stories we choose inform the actual final product. And think it to me, Modern Deity, Josh and I looked at the stories and we came to consensus on what our vision was. But if Josh had done this with David or with Sam, it would have been a different collection. Mm-hmm. I feel like it would have been a different project. And I think that's one of the really interesting things is, you have to have that shared vision when you're doing the co-editors as to what kind of stories you take, how you fit it, especially it's very rare that stories exactly nail the theme. So you're sitting there with a little thing like how many degrees, and I might go, 20 degrees to the right on theme, but Sam's take would be he would be over here on theme. And so, I mean, what do you guys think as far as that goes?
Well, I would agree. I mean, Jean Marie was joking with us before that we tend to, Joshua and I tend to put together fairly dark anthologies. And I think that's particularly true with Derelict, but it's about ghost ships. It's about abandoned vessels in space or on the sea. And I'm not sure how many ways you can make that lighthearted and jovial. I mean, it's kind of a heavy thing.
Gilligan's Island.
So the first, yeah. The first year that I co-edited with Joshua, we did Temporarily Deactivated, and we both kind of came up with the idea for doing this. It was a kind of a return to the temporarily out of order theme that we had done, that Joshua had done a few years earlier and I had contributed a story to. And when we both came up with this idea, I think we were both, in a sense, thinking about similar stories, because I don't remember that anthology or Galactic Stew being as hard to decide on the final stories as this one was. He and I had very different visions for Derelict, and we really needed to compromise. I'm not sure either of us got, I think we got about half the stories we really wanted, and then we had to kind of let the other have the half that he really wanted, because we were just not on the same page with this one. Would you agree with that, Joshua?
Yeah, we had differences of opinions on many, not, I would say maybe 25% of the stories. I think we agreed on the other 75%. You know, we both ranked them really high and whatnot. But there were a couple where it was like, you know, you didn't like it or I didn't like it.
Yeah, a lot of 5s from me and 1 from Joshua, or 5s from Joshua, and I was giving it a 0 or a 1. Yeah, there were a couple that were just way off.
That's unusual, and it's gonna. It raises a question I'm going to ask after I ask Sam if, you know, basically his involvement, how he got sucked into When Worlds Collide, and did you experience the same kind of disconnect on it that
Actually,
David
I'd
did?
say that I'll be the out vote here. I'm not sure that David I can't speak with because I haven't edited with David. I can't speak for because I haven't edited with David. But with Patricia and Josh, I've edited with both of them, and I would say this experience was very similar both times. That we mostly agreed. There might have been 1 or 2 stories that we were really, you know, at odds about, but that we fairly quickly resolved that. Really, that for the bulk of, because we're really talking about 6 or 7 stories here that we take from the non-anchor authors, and usually we're pretty on board for 5 or 6 of them. It's, you know, there might be a discussion over which the last one's going to be, and that discussion might run more along, well, we need a comic story, or we need another fantasy story. So which is the best of those? And what I find most interesting about this is the way we agree so much, despite the fact that I would say that as writers, we're very different. Our books are very different that we write. And I always have had, going into this at the beginning, I had some trepidation about whether, you know, oh my God, you know, we don't see eye to eye. We don't even see eye to eye about what books we like. How are we going to see eye to eye as editors? And remarkably, we do. And I find that one of the most refreshing parts of working with, you know, the crowd here, the happy crowd. Oh, we're so happy. Is because we get along and we agree and it's fun, you know, and we hate the same stories and we complain about them, and we mostly love the same stories too. And we, you know, say, oh man, we got really lucky this time. And that makes it fun, even if the pay is terrible, John.
Okay, one of the things that, you know, I'm hearing about how the stories you receive shape the anthology. And I remember in one particular anthology, alternate piece, you were expecting a bunch of sci-fi stories, and it wound up being really straightforward alternate history for the most part. And but you don't start these are not anthologies that are entirely slush anthologies. You always start with a base of anchor authors. How do you choose those anchor authors, and how much do the things that they give you when you're pitching the idea to them and they're pitching back at you, how much do they influence and shape the anthologies? And I'd like to hear everybody's thoughts on this.
Anybody want to start? Well, I'll start really quick. The way we choose the anchors is usually I contact the whoever the co-editor is going to be, and even if I'm not one of the editors on the anthology, I kind of email whoever the editors are, and I just say, you know, who can you give me a list of who your dream, you know, anchors would be, and you know, I say there's no limits, you know, don't limit yourself. Like I've invited Stephen King, I've invited Neil Gaiman. I mean, so you know, no limits. Just give me your list, and then we usually start at the top of the list. Once I have a list, I usually start at the top of the list, and I just start emailing anchors to see if they're interested.
Mhm.
And some of them, most of them are people that like we've met at conventions, or you know that we know through the publisher or something like that. Some of them though, I'm just emailing them out of the blue. Like they have, as far as I know, they have no idea who I am. And then we just kind of go down the list until we have you know 6, 7, 8 anchors to anchor the anthology. And then after that, like you said, we go to a slush pile to fill out the rest of the anthology. I'll let everybody else talk about the rest of the anchor experience.
Yeah, how do the people you wind up with as your anchor authors shape the anthology even before the slush starts coming in? You know, I can only speak to Deities because I know that we had to provide a list of the gods we were interested in playing with. And I know there was a certain amount of discussion that, hey guys, they're all Greco-Roman.
There was
I'm guilty of that. So yeah.
Well, there was Deities and a couple other projects, like when we went to, you know, the Return to the Urbar, you know, like some of those we sign you up, we say, you know, Jean Marie, we'd love for you to be an anchor, but you have to pick something ahead of time because we can't have you and David and Sam as anchors all send stories that conflict with each other. You've picked the same god, you've picked the exact same era, you've picked the setting, you know, because the anchor stories are going to be in there. So if you pick, you know, Jean Marie says, I need Zeus, you know, I need Zeus, I have to write a Zeus story. Then if we get 1,000 Zeus stories in slush as an anchor, we're not going to take all the slush stories. We're, you know, you've staked that for that project. But some other projects, people say they'll write, and we have no idea until they turn their story in. Sometimes after deadline.
No, that never
Not
happened.
that that's never happened, but sometimes we'll have finished our slush and we're still waiting for somebody to send in the story, not naming any names here, and we have no idea what the story's about, so we can't make any decisions. That's the worst case. But so, you know, it is sometimes, you know, someone will say, I know I promised you a noir piece, but I've written as a comic fantasy. And we're like, okay, we're professional writers. We know this happens, you know, but it is, and then that shapes, and then you have to balance, and you pick the slush to fill in the holes from what, you know, the anchor pieces you've got set in here, and then you say, I need something that balances this, I need something that balances this, or I can't take another Greco-Roman god story, you know, somebody, if, you know, we can get a different, you know, pantheon, we're excited.
And you did get to have a really wild one at for Deities that I know of, is the god of gaming, a Mesoamerican god of gaming, and it actually matched the cover.
Josh loved I mean, you know, was over the moon with that story. And I have to tell you, Josh, I heard from Jennifer Dunn, that is her favorite story in the anthology. And I think it's the math background. I think there's something about having an advanced degree in math or something that story just lights up the brain centers.
Hey, it lit up mine too. I thought it was
Yeah.
wonderful. I couldn't believe that it was Daniel Roman's first published fiction. It was just amazing. So, yeah,
Sounds great.
it is. It is. What about you, Sam, and you, David? How do the anchor authors how have they shaped this particular and When Worlds Collide and Derelict for you? How did they shape it?
In When Worlds Collide, we had a situation that plays directly into what Patricia just said. You wouldn't think it was possible for something as wide open as When Worlds Collide, but two anchor authors sent in a story about Alexander the Great. So, I mean, when Josh and I realized that, we thought, gee, let's just hope that, J.K. Rowling doesn't send in a story about Alexander the Great over Slush, because then we got a problem. But it was, luckily the stories were very different in tone. They did not, one of them luckily did not take place. One of them took place in 325 BC or whatever. And the other one took place 1,000 years later, 800 years later. So it wasn't an impossible issue, but it was something we had to address. We had to look at this. We had to, do we want to ask one of them to change the story? Heaven forbid. We quickly dumped that idea. But it is, it can happen. It certainly meant that anybody who came in Slush with a story remotely related to ancient Greeks was going to be gone. It could have been the best story in the world. There wouldn't have been room for it. We couldn't have three stories that were that close in subject matter. So it really, the anchors really do play a big part. The other thing that often happens is if you get nothing but, science fiction stories from the anchors, well, then we're going to be looking extra close for fantasy stories or comedies or maybe a horror story from the Slush. So they do have, which makes it hard because we can't really decide what we want to do, what other stories are going to be in until we've received all of those stories, even the very late ones, from the anchor authors.
Yeah, and that was certainly the case with Derelict, that our anchor authors ended up giving us a collection of stories that were fairly heavily skewed toward SF. And they were great stories. Julie Cernada's story is phenomenal. It's one that really ties in beautifully with the recent unpleasantness during 2020 and early 2021, and now again in later 2021. But it just tied in beautifully. It's a gorgeous story. It's actually a fairly long story, but boy, it works as the centerpiece of the collection. And Christine Smith gave us a gorgeous story as well, but they were science fiction stories. And really, aside from my own story, I think all the anchor stories were science fiction. And so we really did have to tease out of the slush pile a few more fantasy stories than we might have otherwise, which is not to say we had to go slumming looking for a story that shouldn't have been in that we took anyway, because the stories we took are really good. But we were in a situation where we had a couple of stories that were very close, that we could have gone this way, we could have gone this way, but this one was magic and this one was tech, and we needed the magic to balance out the anthology. But aside from a situation like what Patricia was describing, I don't think that where you have to kind of assign things ahead of time to make sure that you get a balanced anthology. I'm not sure the anchor authors really influence things prior to our going through the slush and trying to figure out what stories slot into certain parts of the anthology. That's a pretty specific issue related to a certain kind of anthology. And certainly that wasn't the case with Derelict, nor was it the case with Galactic Stew or Temporally or any of those.
Yeah. Well, it does, though, however, highlight something that aspiring authors don't realize, that it's not always about the quality of the story. It's sometimes about requirements and situations beyond anyone's control. You know, if an
Yes.
anchor author writes once, as in the case of When Worlds Collide, you've got 2 stories about Alexander and you've only got 15 total. Another story that deals with Alexander comes really close to that Greco-Hellenistic vibe. No matter how good it is, you know, it's going to be something you can't deal with.
We were actually lucky. The original story I had thought just to write for When Worlds Collide was going to have a Hellenic theme.
Mhm.
Luckily I decided no, I didn't. I had a better idea and went with that. Otherwise, I had to rewrite my whole story because I would have been the one that would have been told, no, we're not having another Greco-Roman story.
So what did you come up with for your story?
My story is an odd one. It actually comes from a science fiction novel that I started about 10 years ago, maybe 12 years ago now, which after I wrote a draft, I realized, no, this is going to take much longer than I thought. I got to get something out. And I've got a much better idea for a vampire story. And so I didn't do anything more with the science fiction story. I rushed into the vampire story at the perfect moment when vampires, which had been so big, dropped off the face of the planet. So that was that went so much for that idea. But there was a core of a story that I had written in pieces that were going to be in different spots in the novel. It's about an AI program that arrives in our computer net. You won't quite understand that. I'm kind of giving the game away here a little bit by saying that at the outset, because you don't quite understand that until perhaps a third of the way into the story. In fact, Josh maybe cut. It was going to be halfway into the story until Josh maybe cut half of the first half, because he said, "No, we got to get to the point. Got to get to the point. Got to get to the point."
It's the first act reveal. You know
Yes.
that one, Sam.
Yeah, you got that right. And so it's there are no human beings in it. It's a story basically from the AI's point of view, of the AI coming into consciousness, and then the AI trying to figure out what exactly it is, and where it is. I'm losing my mind. I can't remember the title, which is why the title of the story is
What and why?
What and why? Yeah, I couldn't remember whether it was where and what or what and when, but it's what and why. When you get old like me, you start to forget these things. I wrote that story, 8 months ago. It's a whole
It's
other
in
life.
ancient history now. Yes, it's back in the Hellenic times. Yeah.
That's right, it's back in there. So anyway, that's how that story came out, and it turned out I was lucky that I changed my mind, because the other story I written would not have fit. And I wouldn't have known it until December when we finally got the anchor stories in, and then it would have been a rush to get something else done.
David, you also wrote a story for Derelict under your other writing name, DB Jackson. Could you tell us a little bit about that one?
Yeah, it's set in my Thief Taker universe. This is, I think, the 4th or 5th story for a ZNB anthology that I've written in the Thief Taker universe. So for those who aren't familiar, the Thief Taker books and stories are historical urban fantasies set in pre-revolutionary Boston. And my lead character is a conjurer and a thief taker, which means he kind of he's a detective of a sort. And in this case, he is hired to help salvage the cargo of a wrecked ship along the Rhode Island coastline. And when he gets to the ship, he finds that the cargo is not at all what he thought it was going to be. And I'm not going to say more than that, but it was a really fun story to write. As soon as Joshua and I started talking about me being co-editor of the anthology, this story presented itself to me, and I knew what I was going to do with it very early on, which isn't always the case. Sometimes I need some time to figure out what I'm going to do with these stories. But that one, I knew very early on where it was going and what I was going to do with it. And I thought it came out pretty well. I'm very happy with it. It's called The Wreck of the Sarah Moore.
Okay, cool, cool. Patricia, I feel bad that we haven't seen more of your fiction recently, and I'm hoping there's going to be some in the future.
Yeah, Josh will tease that later, I think. But yeah, no, it's
It better be.
it's interesting. I actually have written a couple of stories for the anthologies, but I always kept myself in reserve because what happened when we did our first project, After Hours Tales from the Earth Bar, we had anchor drop very last. And so I, feeling like, what can we do? Oh, look, we have an editor who can also write, and she's got about 6 hours. So like, there was a story. So that was my first professional short story, project, but that was also always the plan B. And that was and then for Where, I also did a story when it was looking a little thin, which was also a really funny story that I had to write. But yeah, that was the when you're like, you've passed the point of no return, and you at that time we were under contract to deliver so many thousand words, and we were short. Somebody has to write it. So there you go. But yeah, and I think Josh already had a story, and I was like, okay, we can do it. But yeah. I don't normally think short, although I've got another, a couple of short ideas, but
okay. Well, I'm looking forward to that teasing, but why don't you tell us a little bit about, the Modern Deity's Guide to Surviving Humanity. Give the people a hint, some idea of the kinds of stories that are in there. We've already mentioned, Daniel Romans, and I will throw in a plug for Fire Sale, which is my take on what happens when Dionysus and Mammon get together.
Sounds great.
It's what's really interesting about it is that, because it's the modern deity, while we did have the pantheon of gods, it needed to be set roughly present day. So that was also a limit on both the anchors and the slush. We couldn't take someone sending a story, that's set back, in the Middle Ages, and we're like, great, it's got a deity, but it doesn't get the modern concept. So, but there, we have some fun stories that are in there. We have some really interesting. Carrie Sparing did a very interesting take on women's magic, which was the traditions, the Celtic traditions around that, and flipping one of the old tales, which was very fascinating. Crystal Sarakis' first story is the one that opens, The Weight of the Feather, which was, someone we knew was going to be, when you read her writing, it was just a matter of time before somebody had the honor of being, publishing her first story. We have some very darker shows. There's a very interesting voodoo-esque tale that's in there.
That one's very good, yeah.
Yeah, that's
Dr. Saturday.
Today's Midnight Medicine show. Yeah, you have to read it twice. I love the stories where like what the author does, you think it through and you're like, now I have to go back because and see all the clues that were peppered in there. So there's some great, and then there's a story in there that was actually submitted for a different project. And it had been a couple of years. And so Josh and I are like, I feel like I've read this before. And sure enough, we went, and so actually we're like, this feels a little familiar. And it actually had been submitted for an urban fantasy project. Didn't fit, resubmitted for this, and here it fit. And that's, that was Sharon's Taxi and Limo Court was. But so sometimes, again, it wasn't the story, to your point earlier, Jean, sometimes the story on its merits is good, but if it's not the right fit, then we say no, but it might be a better fit for a different project. In this case, it was.
Okay, great. Sam, could you tell us a little bit more about When Worlds Collide, some of the individual stories, other than your own, which we know is your favorite?
Of course, it's my favorite.
Yeah.
But I wanted to add one thing to what Patricia had said. We've, I think it was in Submerged, we also published a story that didn't make the cut for another book. So it does happen. It's happened more than once, and we love it when it happens because there's nothing we hate more than having to say no to a really good story that just doesn't happen to fit the anthology. And so it's great to give a second chance sometimes. As for When Worlds Collide, there's a real mix of stories. I think Josh and I were happy with this one. We got a lot of different kinds of stories. One of my favorites, I got to read the title for this because it's way too long otherwise. How the Fae of Savernake Forest Fought the AI Who Ate the World. And that's just what it is. It's just what it says it is. It's a story where Fae fight an AI. And we were just kind of blown away by the fact that it worked. You wouldn't think that kind of story would really work, but this story worked. And it kind of, and could you have any more of a summation of two worlds colliding than AI and Fae? And so that worked really well. And then you go to another one. There's a really good story by I'm having a mind blank again. I got to look everything up. By Esther Friesner called Seeley with a Kiss. And this time it's okay. We actually debated about whether this really fit or not. Is this really worlds colliding? Because what collides are two different concepts of elves. One is the traditional, elves of high fantasy, and the other is Santa's elves. And what happens when, the two of those get together for a marriage? So it's a very lighthearted and very different kind of books, kind of story. We have a number of science fiction stories, some that take place on other planets. We have a very kind of fun science fiction story. I won't give this one away, but it's about how the people of Earth are finally going to be invited to join the massive world community, universal community of other intelligences. And they didn't read the contract quite closely enough. And so problems
we never
develop.
do.
And so there's a lot of good stories and a lot of good choices. And I think people would like this one very much because you're going to find if you have a particular like, you're probably going to find it in the book because it's a very broad range.
Okay, great. David, what about Derelict? We've already said it's dark.
It's a little dark, yeah. And I've already mentioned my story, which actually I will say has a happy ending. So,
well, the thief taker kind of has to survive since the thief taker is a continuing character.
Well, but that's not what makes it a happy ending. So you have to read the story.
I will. Don't worry.
And I mentioned Christine Smith's story, which is the first one in the anthology. It's called Symbiote, and it's a wonderful science fiction story. Very dark, very dark. Julie's story, Decay in 5 Stages, is not as dark, but there's a lot of really good stuff in here.
Despite being all about decomposition, it's not as dark.
Again, you have to read the story. Don't judge it by its title. We have a really nice story from Alex Bledsoe, who is one of my favorite authors. And the story is called When the Star Fell and the Levee Broke. And it's kind of a Men in Blackish story, but it's really thoughtful and beautifully done. He's a marvelous writer, one of my favorite writers, actually. We have a couple of the fantasy stories. One is by Jana Panacea. It's called Mercy for the Lost. And it's a high fantasy story, and it works really nicely with the theme. And it's a redemptive story as well. So there's darkness in these, but there's also some cool stuff. There's another one, a particular favorite of both of ours, that had a kind of a woman who had been looked upon as a terrorist, who comes back and kind of rehabilitates an old airship. And in doing so, she encounters this idealistic teenager. And a lot of the story is just the two of them bantering back and forth and talking, kind of reconciling the difference between realpolitik and idealism in the political realm. And it's it's beautifully done. And I don't know if this was, the author's name is Kit Harding. The story is Flight Plans Through the Dust of Dreams. And I don't know if this was Kit's first publication or not, but it's a really nice story.
Cool. Oh, they all sound good. I mean, I've gone through Modern Deities because Joshua sent it to us for proofing. And of course, being a former copy editor and proofer, yours truly had to read it all. The copy editing was great, by the way. I will say that, speaking as a former copy editor, but I haven't yet had a chance to do more than skim on Derelict and When Worlds Collide, but I have them in my TBR pile. Which, speaking of which, I know there's going to be more stuff coming in my TBR pile because you guys are planning another Kickstarter, and at least 2 of my very favorite things in the whole wide world are part and parcel of the themes that you've announced. So Joshua, could you tell us a little bit about the themes and the Kickstarter, and then if you guys could chime in, because you are all, I take it, going to be editing again with or without co-editors. So if you guys could tell us a little bit about it, and most especially, when's it going to start?
Okay, so yes, we're gonna run another Kickstarter. The tentative date at the moment, start date, is August 11th at noon Eastern Standard Time. So August 11th at noon, and as we've been doing for the last, I don't even know how many years, we're gonna do 3 new anthologies. The first one is going to be edited by David Coe and myself, or no, David Coe and John Zakur, and it's called Noir, and it's supposed to be science fiction and fantasy, detective, private eye stories, obviously in that subgenre. The key there, I think, is the fantasy and science fiction. It's got to have that element to it for this particular anthology. Or at least it's got to have the trappings of that, even if in the end they prove that it's not, that it's something more mundane. But yeah, David and John Zakur are going to be editing that one. The second one is going to be edited by Sam and myself. And that one's called Brave New Worlds. And the idea there is we want stories that are set somewhere along the timeline of humans leaving Earth and traveling to another planet, and, you know, with the idea that, you know, we're going to settle on this planet or something along those lines. So it doesn't have to be about the whole journey. If you can pull off the whole journey